Great. Okay, so let's start up. Good to see everybody. It's continuing to be like interesting between the room and the Zoom, but we're figuring it all out. So last time I said you could totally come each time it's its own thing, but still there is some continuing themes. So last time we ended up with the Hasmoneans. Not actually, we didn't end up. We talked about the Hasmoneans. Larry, are you causing problems again? I'm teasing. Okay, so that's on the video. So we talked about the Hasmoneans, and we had these coins. Again, just to review very briefly, because I want to move forward to other things. But the history, if you remember, there's like Hanukkah time, and the history is 2nd century BCE. And politically, what's fascinating about the Hasmoneans are here there are priests who become kings, which is not obvious, right? In fact, that's the opposite of obvious, because the biblical design seems to be that Judah, the tribe of Judah, is supposed to be the king. Like King David comes from the tribe of Judah. And here we have, historically, we have that the priests are kings. So we talked about last time how to think about that conceptually. Is that, just fine? Like, is it fluid? Which tribe? Again, this is sort of distant from us because this is 2,000 years ago and there hasn't been a Jewish king for a long time, although there's a Jewish, prime minister, of course, thank God. So these issues are lively, but we're still trying to figure out sort of the ideal way that, that's what this class is about. We're using the Talmud to think about Talmudic politics. So historically, there was this period where the priest was the king. And is that good or bad? Just 1 second, so just to review, please, that we said that seems to be different than the ideal design. It seems to conflate two different roles: the role of the David or Judah, the king, and the role of the temple of the priest. But maybe that's an ideal system in a way. If you could converge, if you could unite, right? Maybe that there's something ideal to that. So we brought different sources. What I wanted to try to stress is that I think most sources don't love that union and think that in ideal Jewish design, the political head, the king, or whoever else it is instead of a king, whether it's a council or a prime minister or whatever, that should be different than the priesthood. And we said that that's a little surprising because today, again, if we bracket Jewish sources and think like in Western terms or American terms, we have these notions of separating church and state. So that seems very, intuitive. We're used to it. We think it's a good thing. I think by and large, I could speak about most of us or all of us. We think that's a good thing, but it's not obvious that you should separate church, synagogue, priesthood from the state within a religious tradition. Right? Maybe you think within a religious tradition, the ideal would be to combine, not to separate. So that's what's interesting, and that's what we talked about last time. So even though here we have just these coins where we see what the point of the coins, just to refresh your memory, or for those who are joining tonight, the coins are from the Hasmonean times, from 2nd century BCE, and here you have this coin that on the one hand says one side says in Greek, the Jewish king, and on the other side says in Hebrew, the high priest. Because it was the same figure. Under the Hasmoneans, it was one figure, really two sides of the same coin. But that was an exception. That was an anomaly. And according to many Jewish sources, that's at least not an ideal. Dr. Roses, 2 classes ago, said to the extent we could tie these sources into traditions that are part of the Western political tradition over time, that would be interesting. So I don't want to get bogged down because it's complicated, but I recently heard a lecture by a Harvard professor who we've already mentioned here, Eric Nelson. Just let's make sure we're not frozen here. And Nelson quoted in a totally different context. He wasn't speaking about the Hasmoneans, but he just said in passing, and then I searched for the passage because I was like, this is interesting. He cited James Harrington. Now, for a lot of people in the room, you probably haven't heard of James Harrington. That's fine, okay? But James Harrington in the 17th century was a big deal. He was this English political theorist, and he was, right there in the heart with other political thinkers that were watching England change over the course of the 17th century, where it was shifting from a monarchy to a parliamentary system. And he writes this work, which is a utopia of Oceania, it's called. And it's a work, a mid-17th century British English work, which is a political utopia. And it's about the ideal of a republican or a democratic form of government rather than monarchy. And what's interesting for us, why we suddenly learning 17th century text, and we're just going to look at it just briefly, because even though Harrington is obviously not Jewish, but still Harrington is interested in the Bible. Like a good religious, because a lot of these figures, they were religious, Protestants or, everybody with their exact variety, but basically Protestant thinkers and political thinkers. And they saw the Bible as God's vision of how a commonwealth should be organized. So I won't get into how this works out, but somehow Harrington sees the Hebrew Bible as supporting democracy. Now that takes some creativity to see in the Hebrew Bible democracy, okay? But he sees within the Hebrew Bible democracy, and then he brings up, so democracy or aristocracy, that's also good for him. He thinks aristocracy is also good because he doesn't so much trust, just the point on democracy versus aristocracy is democracy is everybody, aristocracy is the elite. And even though he has this democratic sort of impulse, he's also a little skeptical about trusting the masses with all the important decisions, right? So maybe we should not have a king, right? That's bad, that let's move from a king, but let's make sure Parliament runs the show, not the masses. So he sort of says democracy and aristocracy, and he sees this in the Bible also. So then he says, thus the aristocracy of Israel. Now he's showing, though, how it broke down. That's what he's saying in this paragraph. And it's not the easiest paragraph, so I'll just read it briefly. But what I want to show you is how the Maccabees, their story and their combining actually resurfaces in political writings in the 17th century as a lesson of things not going well, as things deteriorating. He's a little tentative because he sort of wants to compliment the Maccabees because he sees the Bible and Jewish history as positive, but then he wants to show how things started to deteriorate. And that's what's going on here. Just briefly, thus the aristocracy of Israel became oligarchical. Sorry, it's a little blocked here. Let me just move that. Yeah, it took long steps towards monarchy. So, and that for him is bad. It's moving from democracy or aristocracy to oligarchy to monarchy, which succeeding in the Hasmonean, that's the Hasmonean family, commonly known as the Maccabees, was for their great merit confirmed onto them by universal consent and raising the hands of the people. What he's saying is, it became a monarchy. Well, the Jews at the time went along with it. They liked this monarchy. It was a popular monarchy, right? That's his point. And people raised their hands, meaning that's the democratic. He's trying to show even the monarchy, at least people liked this monarchy and supported it. Nevertheless, unto him that understands the order of a commonwealth, or hath read the Athenian or like a Medanian, that's the Spartan or the Roman story, will be plain enough that but for their aristocracy, they needed not to have been so much beholding onto or to have stood so much in need of one family. What he doesn't like, and that's the criticism, is that it's concentrating so much power in one family. Okay, here he's not so much emphasizing the high priesthood and monarchy, but he is talking about the concentrating of all power in one, and that's bad. So that's just an interesting echo, right, of what we've been talking about. And because what we were talking about is in the ideal Jewish system, should you have the priesthood and monarchy combined or separated? And here there's a echo of this in political thought, that the problem with the Hasmoneans is that rather than power being diffused democratically or aristocratically, there's a concentration. And that's part of what went wrong. And Harrington was read by people such as Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so this is interesting stuff. And of course, we know that Jefferson, all about Republican and a more popular and less of a concentrated federalist system. Okay, so that's a sort of a nod towards some more recent political thought. So now let's go back to the older material. So what I want to try to do together, and I know some people are joining, which is great. So I want to just explain where we are for a second, just for those who are joining us, and to refresh everybody's memory, including myself, and then move forward. So we're using chapter 2. This slide's not so important. One second, I'll try to find us the slide that's important. This one's good. So we're using Sanhedrin, the Mishnah Sanhedrin. Again, this is around the year 200. It's the Mishnah. And Mishnah Sanhedrin, the chapter 2, talks about priest, king, and against the backdrop of chapter 1, which talks about the court. So that's sort of interesting for us moderns, right? Because we think in the United States, there's 3 branches of government. There's a court, and there's a president, and there's a legislator. So that's not the same thing you have here. But here you do have a great court. That's chapter 1. And chapter 2 talks about the priest and then the king. And it talks about the relationship of the court and king to the court. We're going to have to get back to some of that stuff. But what I've sort of gotten into in the last couple of weeks, and I want to keep going with this, is that it's interesting that, let's leave the court aside, even though I think the court is extremely important, more important than even in the United States, where a court's very important. Judiciary is very important, but in the United States, I don't think it's coincidental that the judiciary is the 3rd article of the US Constitution, right? Even though today the Supreme Court's quite, very important, still it's probably, at least in the ideal design of the US Constitution, it was probably envisioned as coming 3rd. We said it's sort of inverted in the order of the Mishnah, the Talmudic Politics, where it leads with the court. And it's not so surprising, because Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, is very legalistic. So the court comes first, and then you have here in chapter 2 these other figures. You have the high priest and you have the king. And again, what we start with tonight is that the high priest and king are 2 different figures, which isn't shocking, okay? Because in the Torah, you hear discuss high priest, and separate you discuss king, and in the Bible you discuss high priest and king as separate figures. But in that Hasmonean during the Maccabees, they got united, but still, again, to repeat, they seem to be separated. But what strikes me as interesting is that I think what I want to, because then we got into this question, okay, if there's a high priest and a king, what's their relationship? Are they equal? Is one, if we had to sort of say in the pecking order, who's on top? I think the court. Who comes second? Does the high priest come second? Does the king come second? Or are they somehow even, balanced? So we saw some sources about this last time. And my intuition, it's hard for, to prove this, but my intuition is that you get the impression that from the Mishnah, that there's a certain symmetry here. It talks about the high priest, then it talks about the king. And it's actually an opposite type of, the high priest judges and is judged, testifies and is testified against. The king doesn't judge, isn't judged, can't testify against. So they're not identical, right? They're distinct figures. They seem to have sort of opposite relationships to the law and to the judiciary. But to me, there's a certain symmetry here, which almost suggests like there's something even about them. Like if we had to, maybe I should have had this like a diagram, like on top is the court, and then two lesser figures who are in the leadership pyramid. It's not 1, 2, 3. That's what I'm suggesting. There's one on top, and then 2 even ones side by side, complementary. So let's hold all of that for a second and go into another topic. And the topic I think is interesting in its own right. I hope you'll agree. Again, we're text-based, interesting within the context of these texts. But I think if you read these texts carefully, you see there are interesting, non-obvious things about them. And then we'll return to this idea of, is there a certain symmetry between high priest and king? So the topic I want to talk about briefly is, sure.
We hear about the kings, right?
Right.
Maybe this is my own personal naivete.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I would have heard in my studies about the high priest. So when you say they're equal, did I just miss that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm talking about. So it's a good question. looking at sources that sort of, the way I understand them, are sort of envisioning ideally how things should be. Historically, it's not necessarily how things played out. And you're right that if you, let's say, if you read like the book of Samuel, right, it's all about, King Saul and then King David. Along the way, there are some high priests, you could find them, but they're playing more background roles. Later on in Jewish history, it's almost the opposite. In Second Temple times, because there isn't always a king, because sometimes they're living under other empires, like the Babylonian and then the Persian, and then for a while there's under the Maccabees they're on their own, but then under the Romans. So for all their time they don't have their own king, Jews. So there are high priests. So actually later on in Jewish history, the high priest is more important than the king. But you're right, in the Bible you hear more king. In later Jewish history you hear more high priest. All of that is important background to these texts. These texts are written in the year 200. There's no king, there's no high priest. There's Romans, and there are Jews who are a minority, but they're still writing about, the way I understand these texts, how ideally things should be. And in this ideal vision of the Mishnah, they imagine a great court, even though there's none in reality at this point in the year 200. And they're imagining that there are these other figures, and they're imagining there's a certain symmetry to them, I want to argue, and that's not obvious. So your point is definitely, spot on, that that's not always what the Bible had or what Jewish history had. It's a certain vision, and it's not necessarily an obvious vision. So I along those lines, this is another example of a text that I think is sort of hard to know if it ever played out, but I think it gives us a window into it's sort of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the rabbis to speak political theory. And they don't speak political theory, they could describe what was, that would be historical works we have in the Bible and here and there. And then sometimes they tell you laws, but they don't so much speak theory. They're not like Aristotle and Plato, but what I'm trying to argue is between the lines, they're sort of giving us a little bit of hints at how ideally they think the political design should work. And that's what I'm trying to do. It's somewhat speculative. It's somewhat like connecting dots. But hopefully, what emerges from it is interesting, not obvious. That to me is the reward of it. So yeah, please. Harrington.
Yeah, bring up oligarch. I looked up now. There was never in Israel an oligarch.
Well, you're asking a good question. But Harrington, I want to sort of move beyond Harrington, but all these political thinkers in the 17th century are sort of trying to do something that's even more speculative or questionable than some of what I'm trying to do here. Hopefully what I'm trying to do is a little more text-based. They're trying to somehow combine political history with Greco-Roman ideas with what's in the Bible. So somehow they'll see within the Bible certain democracy, even though we might not see it. And they might see a certain oligarchy, which is that a few people were empowered at a certain period. Can you find certain stories in the Bible? You could probably find that, So they'll label that oligarchy. It's a good question. So let's get back here to this source, because now we all have to focus in on this source, okay? And let's sort of just try to understand the text, and then I need your help. So the text is towards the end of the Torah. It's Deuteronomy. Okay, we're moving aside from Sanhedrin. We're looking at a text at the end of the Torah, and it's about the commandment of Hakkel. Does anybody know about Hakkel?
Yes.
What's Hakkel? Tell us, please. Something about Hakkel, that every 7 years. Good. At the sabbatical year, which is timely, every 7 years, what is there?
But it's in Israel.
Okay, in Israel, every 7 years. And what do you do on that every 7 years?
You let the land.
That's Shemitah. But Hakkel is every 7 years. You're right. It's related. Every 7 years, you read the Torah. You gather everybody and read the Torah. So let's read a little bit here. Hakkel means to gather like a crowd. Good. So then Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the priests. Okay, this is the very end of the Torah. That's why Moses is writing down all the Torah, and he hands it off to the priests. I need people's help, so pay attention to details. So he takes the Torah and entrusts it to the priests. And the priests put it in the ark. Okay, and he gives it to the elders. Verse 10. And then Moses commands them the following. Every 7th year, in the scheduled year of remission, meaning the sabbatical, every 7th year, meaning in the land of Israel, during the festival of booths, meaning Sukkot, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read the Torah. This law means the Torah, before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, children, as well as even, immigrants who were residing, and they should all hear the Torah. And what's the point of this? That they should hear and learn and fear God and observe the Torah's laws. This is known as Hakkel. So then just saying outside is every 7 years, there's supposed to be a public, we do this every Shabbat, right? Every Shabbat, we read the Torah. The Torah itself says, maybe it would make life a little simpler, that you have to go to a shul, one big reading once every 7 years. And when Sukkot time, once every 7 years, you have a massive Torah reading, and you read the Torah. Sounds like you read all the Torah. Maybe you read parts of the Torah, maybe you read the Decalogue, maybe you read the book of Deuteronomy. Not so clear, fine. But you read it, and apparently there's a certain, the purpose is to instill fear and commitment, okay? Here's the question, and by the way, today, if you go to Israel on Sukkot, they do this ceremony. They do it every year. I don't know, and a nice amount of people show up. It's not all of Israel, but they do this every year on Sukkot. It's actually a nice at the Western Wall. They do this. I don't know how long they've been doing it, last 10, 20 years or something, maybe longer. They read the parts of the Torah, and so they've revived this ceremony. But ideally, this should have happened where everybody comes every 7 years. Here's the question I want to ask. Who reads the Torah? Who does the reading? Who's the Baal Koreh? Who reads? Okay, so one suggestion is the priest. Why? So try to support. It's a good suggestion. Where do you get that from? It's a good guess. Is there any support for that beyond the guess in the text? By the way, if people who are on Zoom want to make a comment, like raise your hands, and I'll try to pay attention.
Around the synagogue, for the first part, you call it Kohen.
Okay, so we know that in our Torah readings, we start with a priest, so that seems to be like give a certain privilege to priests. Good. Any textual support? It's a good guess, but let's support it with text. Okay, verse 9. Does everybody see verse 9? Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the priests. So at the time when Moses was finishing the Torah, he handed off. It's sort of an interesting moment. Who's in charge of the Torah? Or who's the guardian? Who's responsible? Right? Not Rabbi Einsiedler. We're lucky to have that here. But who's responsible when Moses writes the Torah? According to the rabbinic elaboration, there were 13 scrolls of the Torah. Okay, but over here it just says he wrote the Torah and he handed it to the priests and then also to the elders. That's what it says here in the verse. But that doesn't necessarily dictate what would happen every 7th year. The verse doesn't really say when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God, you shall read this law, right? Tikra in the Hebrew. You, but who's the you? Now you could argue it doesn't really matter. You just pick somebody. Maybe the person with the nicest voice, the loudest voice, the best, the person who's, knows the Torah best. Or maybe we should sort of say, well, the priests seem to be privileged here. So maybe in perpetuity, it's the priest. Why is this an important question? It could just be a technical issue, but it sort of seems like symbolic. Like who, once every 7 years, is the mouthpiece, right? Well, Moshe is at the time, that's true, but every 7 years, this is expected to happen throughout Jewish history. So who's the mouth? So the high priest is a good guess. It doesn't say that exactly. So let's read Josephus. Yes, you may.
About where the place is, because it says like, if I read it correctly, even though the word's not capitalized,
Right.
God chooses the place. Whereas in many, because I remember in one paragraph in the Dominic, within the Musaf, I think, where it says that the people will choose the places where, not God, where it's for all the shores regularly. I don't remember.
Yeah, it's actually an important. Thank you. All the comments are good, but you're right that it actually advances a bit the argument we heard. Because verse 11 says, you shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose. And I even told you now, where does it happen? The Western Wall. And what's the idea of the place God will choose? In Deuteronomy, that's the place God chooses. No, going forward, it can't be Sinai because it's talking about throughout Jewish history. So what's the place that God chooses in the book of Deuteronomy? Jerusalem. And where in Jerusalem? The temple. So that's another hint that it's a priest, right? Because it says going forward, this should happen every 7 years at the temple in Jerusalem. You're right, it doesn't say the word temple in Jerusalem. It says the place God chooses. But that's understood within the context of Deuteronomy to be the Jerusalem temple. So we've given some good arguments why it's the priest. And then I want to take the comment. Yeah, okay.
Universal literacy. I mean, what percent?
That's a good comment also. Fair enough, but it could be a leader. You would think that's a good comment. That's a good question also. All the comments have been is very helpful. How many people know how to read? That's a good question and comment, but we would assume the leaders know how to read. Okay, but then we still have a question, who among the leaders? So we have one theory going so far, it's the priest or the high priest. Yeah.
I had another question.
Yeah. Now, so let's read one source that corroborates this idea, and this is Josephus. Just again, we're trying to do a lot in these classes. We're trying to learn some political theory. We're trying to learn reading verses. We're trying to learn how rabbis read verses, sort of like a good advanced stuff. So another thing I'm trying to do each time is when we introduce somebody, not just James Harrington, okay, but also Josephus, just so we should all know who this is, even if you've heard the name. Josephus is the great historian of ancient Jewish history. Without Josephus, we wouldn't know ancient Jewish history. Okay, he's Jewish and he lives really around the time of Jesus, if it makes it helpful. Okay, he lives in the 1st century CE and he lives through the revolt against the Romans. So when the Second Temple is destroyed, so that's in 66 through 70 CE, and he's a general in the fight against the Romans, and he surrenders to the Romans. That sort of puts a sort of a stigma, a blemish on his biography in some people's eyes, because some people see that as cowardice, that he surrendered to the Romans, and then he gets exiled to Rome, and he lives out his life in Rome as a sort of dignified prisoner of war. But he had pretty good conditions there in Rome, and in Rome, he sat there and wrote Jewish history. And that's the way he lived out his years, writing Jewish history. And were it not for him taking that, surrendering to the Romans and being exiled to Rome and having 3 decades to write Jewish history, we wouldn't know ancient Jewish history. So we're, whatever you, if you want to judge or not judge, we're grateful that we have his Jewish history. And right, in this case, by the defeated. Very good. So that's Josephus. So Josephus, so just quickly, one other point about Josephus, because I want to get back to, I don't want to get too derailed, but one other thing, how does he know ancient Jewish history? So he's very observant, right? He notices everything that happens in his lifetime. He reads whatever he can get his hands on. So he learns about the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees, because there are some sources. But that's 200 years before his lifetime. How does he know what happened 1,000 years before his lifetime? So the answer is, well, he has one basic method, which is rely on the Bible. Rely on the Bible. But what he does, which is actually fascinating, is he doesn't say, go read the Bible and I'll pick up after the Bible. He actually spends in his Antiquities, which is his great work of Jewish history, 20 volumes, the first 10 volumes restating the Bible. And again, I think we should be grateful for him restating the Bible, because in his restating the Bible, he sees all sorts of things that we might not see in the Bible. He also omits some things that we think we know are in the Bible. And he finds ways to emphasize things he wants to emphasize and things. So it sort of gives us a window into how one very brilliant and also he learns Greek over the course of his life. He lives out in Rome. So he's a proud Jew, but he has a complex identity. How such a person sees the Bible. How much this represents the way other people, it's hard to know. But there's more to say about that, but I'll leave it at this. So here is a nice example of how he restates verses of Deuteronomy, but he adds something. So let's read it. When the multitude has assembled in the holy city, meaning Jerusalem, so he's making it a little clearer, right? Every 7 years at the season of the Feast of Tabernacles, that's the same thing, Sukkot, let the high priest, standing upon a raised platform from which he may hear, recite the laws to the whole assembly. So he makes clear what was missing in the verse. The verse, shall be read. He tells us who the reader is, the high priest. And that actually is, very good that people here also thought that. And so it's not like shocking what he's saying, but there he has it. And you sort of wonder also, did he see it in his lifetime? Maybe this, he doesn't tell us that this happened in his lifetime, but it's definitely plausible. And maybe that really was the practice. Okay, yeah, there was a question.
So if I can understand
Yeah.
this correct me.
Yes,
if
please.
I'm wrong.
You don't need to keep saying that, Adam.
Was the Torah only being read once every 7 years at this point? And said because it could only be read by the high priest, it would preclude it even further. So it can be read 7 years by a
Right,
single person. So then the
I don't think so. The answer is I don't think
Yeah,
so.
okay.
And the answer is that I think it's clear that the Torah was studied and read. Was it read every Shabbat the way we do now? That's harder to know. We do know right around the same time that in Alexandria, because there's this other important Jew who I like quoting a lot because he's interesting and not enough people know about him, Philo. Philo tells us that every Shabbat in synagogue, they would read the Torah. So at the same time in Alexandria, in Egypt, they were doing it. So presumably at this time also in Israel, they were doing something like that. And certainly people were knowledgeable. So this seems to be, maybe the way I said it a little bit was provocative, but I don't think this is the only time you read the Torah. I'm just saying, if you look in just to backtrack 1 second, I said in the Torah, I think this is the one time the Torah itself demands to read the Torah. But in Jewish history, I think it's clear the practice developed to study and read the Torah. We also know this, by the way, from the New Testament, because there's some scenes there of Jesus going into synagogue and they're reading the Torah. So that seemed to have happened every week, every Shabbat. We don't know I'm not sure offhand. I'd have to think what's our earliest evidence that happened, but that's sort of getting beyond where we need to go. So just the point. So what is the point of every 7 years? Let me just finish this, even whether you're asking or not. Every 7 years, I think the idea is to have this public reading where everybody comes, and it's sort of this symbolic, like recommitting to the Torah and its values.
But then is the thought that reading in synagogue is tradition and this is law?
That's a good question. I don't think that's the way people thought about it by that point. I think by that point they thought they're both laws, but they sort of have a different purpose.
But it doesn't say explicitly read the Torah every Saturday.
Not in the Torah, it doesn't say. We do have sources that say that, but they're from around this time and a little later. Yeah.
When the Torah get sectioned, if you will, you read the scroll, you don't see
Yeah.
portion divided.
Yeah.
When did that happen?
These are good questions. I feel like we're getting a little far afield, but they're good questions. There were different practices. I think it's around, when did it get divvied up into around 50 parshiot? That's the question. Well, one thing I'll just say is that there were different divisions that went on for a while. And there were divisions into an annual to finish up every year, and there were divisions about finishing up basically every 3 years. And that continued on for a long time in Jewish history. So it certainly wasn't fixed yet. Yeah.
I'm probably getting ahead of you.
Yeah.
But there's been all this emphasis on the high priest.
Yeah.
Who is it? The high priest.
Right.
The high priest.
Right.
Why this?
Right.
Why is that so significant that it's the high priest as opposed to just a member of the community? Like what I'm probably jumping ahead.
No, that's good. That's helpful. Within the priesthood, there's a hierarchy that we know. And like Aaron, Moses' brother, is the first high priest. So within the priesthood, there's always this hierarchy where there's one chief priest. So the chief priest, rather than the rest of the priests, and we'll call him the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, that makes sense if we're going to assign this reading to the priesthood. But maybe we'll assign it elsewhere. So let's just see the rabbis for a second, and then I'll try to continue adding a little texture to it. Let's look at what the rabbis say. The rabbis say the following. How was the procedures, this is the Mishnah we're reading now. How is the procedure in connection with the portion read by the king? Now, what procedure? Let's keep reading. At the conclusion of the first day of the festival of Sukkot in the 8th year, meaning at the end of the 7th year, they erect a wooden platform in the temple court, and he, meaning the king, sits upon it. As it is said, at the end of 7 years in the set time, etc. What verse is being cited? Deuteronomy 31. And so who's the reader for the rabbis? The king. Okay, so the rabbis assign this reading not to the clan of the priest and the high priest, but they assign it to the king. And again, except for under the Maccabean Hasmonean period, in general, that was assumed to be not a priest, like a member like David and David's line, like Judah. So it's just a different figure. And that was, again, you could just say there's a technical question, happened every 7 years, somebody had to read it. But we're seeing from the sources, it doesn't seem like we just say whoever has the nicest voice or the loudest voice. It seems to be we give it, according to these traditions, we assign it to a leader. But now we're having these different understandings of who is the leader. Is the leader the high priest, or is the leader the king? Now, if you want to map this on, and you have to do it carefully, like to church versus state, it's sort of interesting who every 7 years, think of it as the very, symbolic moment, at least in the ideal design, every 7 years, all of Israel comes and they renew their commitment to Torah. That seems to be what the ceremony is. It's sort of an interesting question, who runs that ceremony, right? Here at Park East, we have different people have different roles, and we think a lot about it and who does what, and certainly politics in general is choreographed. So here's this interesting early debate among Josephus on the one hand and the rabbis on the other hand of who runs the lead ceremony. Is it the high priest or is it the king? Which might, well, according to the rabbis, it's the king. Why?
Because it says, handed to the head of the synagogue.
No, we'll get there. No, it gets, at the end, it gets to the king.
No, but it's handed to the king by someone else.
Oh, okay. Well,
That's the point.
okay, it's a good point, but let's hold it for a second. It's the king who reads for the rabbis. According to Josephus, it's the high priest, which might shed light on like who's the most important. Again, in the back of your mind, I hope you're remembering my argument is that I think they're sort of equally weighted. But it's true that on this issue, the rabbis are assigning something to the king, which other early Jews around their time thought belongs to the high priest. And that's not so obvious that the rabbi said, by the way, so why would they give it to the king? Does anybody have any speculation about that? Assuming the rabbi, and again, it's just, I want to explain to you why, like learning at this level, now we're getting into how learning is, this is already, I think we're into something not easy to know the answers. Because I said the rabbis gave it to the king. They gave it to the king. Was this their tradition? But still, whenever at some point that tradition developed, that reading of these verses that developed, or that assumption that it belongs to the king, and there was certainly another assumption out there that it belongs to the high priest, and that raises sort of this interesting question of, it would be less surprise. Let me say it this way. It's more, I think, intuitive that it goes to the high priest. Why? First of all, in the verses, there was support that it should go to the priest. Moses gave it to the priest. The ceremony's happening in the temple. Okay, there are good reasons just in the verses to think it goes to the priest. Also, we think of the high priest as in charge of cult and religious rites, or what I'm calling church or the synagogue, right? So if the high priest does it, that would not sort of surprise me. The rabbinic tradition actually is less obvious and more sort of novel. It's the king. Maybe deliberately, maybe in other words, I'm sorry to get a little complex here, but maybe deliberately the rabbis don't want to think of the king just as the state. They want the state to be linked to the recommitment to the Torah every 7 years, perhaps. I'll leave it at that. This is surprising. The rabbinic tradition. Now, here I want to, yeah. Okay, that's fine. So we're getting, it's a good point, but that's a good point, but we're getting back to the point that I said a little while ago, which is that all these texts, I think, are idyllic texts. They're utopian texts. They're saying if everything was working fully, who would be in charge, right? Because this ceremony, you could ask historically, did the ceremony happen every 7 years? And my guess is probably some version of it. Did it happen that everybody really convened every 7 years? I don't think we have evidence to that, so it's not possible. But I don't know how much it happened, if it ever happened. Certainly when the rabbis are talking, In the year 200 CE, this is not happening. There's no king, but there's no high priest either, right? So there is a head of a synagogue. That's true. Well, there's not one head.
No, but is it a rabbi? Is it an Yisrael?
Yeah, it's a good question. We'll get back to that in a couple of classes. In an indirect way, we'll get back to that question. Now, here, so is everybody with me? Let me just review. I also see in the chat. Let me look in the chat. Just 1 second. If there's a question there. The king. Okay. So somebody. So let me just review. Are we all together? Where are we up to? Tonight, I began with that, just a point about the Hasmoneans being a unification of priesthood and kinghood, and then we saw an echo of that in early modern political thought. Okay. Then we went back to the sources, and we saw in the sources that there's king and high priest, and they're distinct figures. And I sort of returned to the issue I raised last time: is there a hierarchy, or are they on par with one another? Then I said, let's hold that thought and go to another subject, and we'll come back to the idea of hierarchy, and we're starting to get to that idea of hierarchy. The subject we got into is Deuteronomy 31, introducing us to a ceremony every 7 years. This ceremony is known as the Hakkel ceremony, the gathering ceremony. And the idea is that every 7 years, all of Israel, men, women, children, right? That's telling. They're all supposed to come. Why? Because apparently it's a public rededication to the Torah once every 7 years. So I raised the question, who reads the Torah? The plain text of the Torah is not explicit. So we saw some hints, and then Josephus says it explicitly, it's the high priest. And then we see this rabbinic tradition that it's the king. And that already sort of gives the king, at least for the rabbis, not just a political role, but at least one important religious role in the ideal utopian arrangement. But here, I'm sorry to get a little complicated, but I have to get a drop more complicated here. But we could all do it. Let's follow along. And I want to show you sort of the richness sometimes of the Mishnah if you read it carefully. You can miss this, but I think once you notice it, you were onto something. So what's it that we're onto? What are we reading? We're reading a Mishnah, but you notice the Mishnah is in a tractate called Sota. You see that? Yeah. And Sota is maybe not our favorite topic, but it's the biblical passages about the ritual if there's a suspected adultery. Okay, and that we don't need to get all into that right now. That's an interesting or challenging topic. But so why are we talking about the king's reading in the context of a tractate that's about a different topic? To understand that, so again, let's just follow along with me, and if anything's not clear, ask, please. We have to go back a little bit. We're in chapter 7, but let's go into Mishnah Sota, the beginning of chapter 7. And we see the following interesting topic. We're not really just talking about the case of a suspected adultery anymore. The Mishnah later on in this tractate in chapter 7 got onto a different topic. It's an interesting topic. The topic is what rituals in Judaism must be said in Hebrew and what can be said in translation. That's the topic he got into. And why they get into this? Because the Sota, right, the suspected adultery involves a certain statement. A certain statement has to be made. In the case of a suspected adultery, does that need to be said in Hebrew or in any language? And the Mishnah says the following may be recited in any language. And they say the section concerning Sota, by the way, in the continuation, which I didn't bring, they said Shema, the Shema prayer. Okay, if you're in synagogue and you're struggling with the Shema prayer and you're trying to do it in Hebrew and you're having a hard time, according to the Mishnah, you don't need to struggle. Say it in English. And they also say the Amidah, you could say it in English. Okay, according to the Mishnah, all those things don't need to be said in Hebrew. They can be said in English. But the Mishnah then says some things need to be said in Hebrew. Now, let's not get into the question, why do they need to be said in Hebrew? And how does the Mishnah know what could be said in translation, what could be said in Hebrew? Those are good questions, but we're not studying. We're just using this Mishnah to highlight a point about the king and the high priest. So now let's look at the list of what's said in Hebrew. The following are recited in the Holy Tongue. The reading made at the offering of the first fruit. Okay, let's not get bogged down. The reading and recitation of Chalitza, let's not get bogged down. Blessing of curses, let's not get bogged down. Priestly blessing, Okay, that's what we do, by the way, in synagogue, like on holidays, there's the priestly blessing. Rabbi Schneier sometimes recites it, right? That needs to be said in Hebrew. And then we have two other things, the blessing of the high priest and the section of the king. Now, you read this in the Mishnah, and unless you've studied the continuation, you're a little confused. What is the blessing of the high priest? And what is the reading of the king? Right? Unlike the Shema, unlike the regular priestly blessing, those are things we know. And not everybody knows them, but if you've hung out in synagogue, you know those things. But what is the blessing of the high priest? And what is the section of the king? The last two items. Is everybody with me at the very end? What are those two items? So here, let's start with the source we saw already. What is the portion read by the king? Right? What's the portion read by the king? That is the Hakkel. The Hakkel every 7 years. That's every seven. That's what the Mishnah means when it says the section of the king or the portion of the king. The section of the king means every 7 years the king reads the Torah at the Sukkot holiday. And what's the blessing of the high priest? So let's look at the Mishnah and see what it is. Let's look. Yeah, let's read it in English. How were the benedictions of the high priest? Well, by the way, I'm sorry, the English is a little choppy here. It said the blessing here, it says benediction. I used some different translations. That's a little confusing. So it's all good. So what are the blessings of the benediction of the high priest? The answer is let's read this together. The Chazan of the synagogue takes the Torah scroll, gives it to the president of the synagogue. The president of the synagogue gives it to the vice president of the synagogue. The vice president of the synagogue gives it to the high priest. And the high priest stands, receives this scroll, and reads the following portions. On the 10th day. What are we talking about? On the 10th day. Does anybody have a guess? On the 10th day. Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur. So what are they saying on Yom Kippur? They're saying on Yom Kippur, there would be a public Torah reading. This is a little hard. If you have never seen this text and it's a little confusing, that means you're reading it. Okay, so follow along. I'll try to make it all clear. They're saying that the high priest would say blessings. We haven't seen the blessings yet. Actually, what they're saying is that once a year, the high priest would read the Torah. The high priest has a reading of the Torah. And when is that? On Yom Kippur. And we know on Yom Kippur, if you pay attention in the long prayers in the morning, you'll see that in the Musaf prayer of Yom Kippur, we talk about the high priest. We talk about the temple, we talk about the high priest, and we talk about the offerings, and we talk about the confession. And according to what the rabbis are telling us, the high priest also would read the Torah. And there's actually a ceremony. If you didn't know, you don't know exactly who is this Chazan who gives it to the president and the vice president and all that. What do you see? It reminds us like of Park East. There's a nice procession. There's a nice procession. Who gets to open the ark and who takes out the Torah and who hands the Torah. There's a whole ritual. It starts with the Chazan. He gives it to the president, who gives it to the vice president, who gives it to the high priest. And then the high priest receives it and reads it. This is on Yom Kippur. It tells us what he reads. And then what's the very end? And then he says blessings. He says a number of blessings after his Torah reading. Okay? So the blessing of the high priest, that's actually incomplete. It's not that the high priest just has a blessing. There's actually a ceremony of taking out the Torah, high priest getting the Torah and reading it on Yom Kippur, followed by a number of blessings. This happens annually on Yom Kippur. And then what happens for the king? Now let's look a little more carefully at the king. What happens every 7th year? Let's read it again. How is the procedure in connection with the portion read by the king? At the conclusion of the Sukkot, at the conclusion of the first day of Sukkot, in the 8th year, at the end of the 7th year, they erect a wooden platform in the temple court. He sits upon it, the king, as it says, at the end of 7 years in the set time, Okay, and now follow the ceremony. The synagogue attendant, by the way, again, the translation is a little my nemesis here. The synagogue attendant, meaning the chazan, takes the Torah scroll, hands it to the head of the synagogue. That's what in the previous text was called the president. In the Hebrew, it's the same. That president gives it to the deputy. That's what in the previous source is called the vice president, who hands it to the high priest, and the high priest hands it to the king, meaning basically the same ceremony of taking out of the Torah, and you give it to the king, and the king reads it, and it's a little cut off, but by the way, the continuation, which I couldn't squeeze in here, and he concludes with saying 8 blessings. So if you didn't follow all the details, I want to sum up. This is the odd thing that's happening here in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is actually telling us that there's not one public Torah reading, there are 2 public Torah readings. Aside from every Shabbat, there are 2 big deals. Like today, right, in a synagogue, we want to know who's the Chassan Torah on Simchas Torah, right? And the big day in the synagogue, who gets to, do something with the Torah? So the Mishnah's answer is there are actually 2 big days. There's Yom Kippur every year, and then there's Sukkot every 7 years. Every year on Yom Kippur, it's the high priest show. And what's the high priest? What happens? There's a big taking out of the Torah ceremony, a whole to-do, a whole choreographed, who hands it off to whom. Then it's received by the high priest. He reads the Torah and he concludes with 8 blessings. That's every Yom Kippur. And then every 7th year on Sukkot, basically the same exact thing happens, but this time, whose show is it? The king's. There's a big to-do, taking out the Torah, a ceremony procession, handing the Torah. The king receives it. The king reads the Torah and concludes with 8 blessings. So it's sort of like sneaky, but once you start noticing it, what the rabbis managed to basically do, they basically said, to me, overall, there might be a slight nuance. If one of you wants to push back, I'll relate to it. But overall, the impression is there are 2 leaders who need to have a big showtime moment. The high priest annually, Yom Kippur, and the king every 7 years. And it's navigated, right, through this sort of division of ceremonies. We create the big day for each, right? We create the day of the priest and the day of the king. And it's basically the same thing. Taking out the Torah, reading the Torah, and 8 blessings, and everybody's there, and everybody's wow, and it's a big deal. So, yeah. Yeah. Sure.
The big year for the king.
Yeah.
Is supposed to be
Once every 7 years.
But then why? Oh wait, somebody's.
Sorry. Yeah.
But why then here does it have the king standing and receiving it? And then
Because he's the final person who reads it. This is the source about every 7 years. No, this is every 7th year.
oh,
This is every 7th year. Okay, I'm mindful of the clock, so we just have a few more minutes, but let me just sort of say what I'm trying to, I have this theory that I'm trying to advance, and it's a little subtle, but I think once you notice it, it sort of seems not obvious, and it does seem deliberate. And the theory is that the rabbis are finding ways to sort of keep an even, balanced distribution of responsibilities or characterizations or sort of constitutional roles to these 2 figures. Because in the ideal rabbinic state, they both are important. There's going to be this religious head, that's the high priest, and there's going to be this more political head, the king, but it's within a religious system. So even the king needs to have his Torah reading moment, okay? Here, actually, they're sort of imitating each other. Back to our source, so let me just return briefly to, let me go like just a few more minutes, we'll wrap up by 8:10, I think we started at 7:10, so let's get the hour. So I wanna, just a few minutes, look back at Mishnah Sanhedrin. So if you look at Mishnah Sanhedrin, now let's get back to our main source. But even here, we got to be ambitious here. So we can't just reread, and I want to show how even here things are interesting. So let's look. The high priest judges and is judged, testifies, and one can testify against them, performs certain ceremonies, and then it talks about what would happen if the high priest, there's, God forbid, there's a funeral in the family. What would the high priest do? And the king here is the exact opposite. King doesn't judge, isn't judged, doesn't testify against, doesn't perform this marriage ceremony, doesn't participate in funerals. So here, there's also, to me, there's a symmetry, but it's not that, it's a little different than Sotah. In Sotah, they're similar to each other. Here, they're opposite of each other. But I see them still as similar sources in that there's a sort of distribution and a balance and parity between them. Although here, the interesting thing is that this source to me is more interesting in a way, because they're not just like both getting their big moment in the spotlight. Here, they're actually having different roles. And this is where we're going to have to start doing a deeper dive into figuring out why they have different roles. So let's just focus. Just give me one more second. Just give me one more second. I'm sorry that cut off. But so look at the opening line of both, because I need to get one last source in tonight. The high priest judges and is judged, testifies and testimonies brought against him, just to make sure everyone understands what that means. That means the high priest could be on the judiciary. Is judged, meaning the high priest doesn't have sovereign immunity, no presidential immunity, no qualified immunity. The high priest can be summoned into court, right? Just like everybody basically can be summoned into court, so can the high priest. So there's something good about the high priest, right? A power can be judged, can judge, but also a sort of a limit, is judged, right? Testifies means just like anybody who knows testimony testifies, so to the high priest. Testimonies brought against the high priest, meaning the high priest is not immune. If the high priest is on trial, there could be testimony against. And what about the king? The king, not any of that, meaning there's also a plus and minus. The king can't judge, that's a minus. The king can't be on the judiciary, right? This source is a little, it's fascinating because it's a little complex. It's saying there are pluses and minuses. The high priest can be a judge, but also can be summoned into court. The king cannot be a judge, but also is immune. That's sort of interesting. They go together. They sound like they go together. The same king who cannot judge also, that's the limit on the king, but we give the king a certain prerogative or a power of protection, immunity. Okay, this is in the Mishnah. I'm sorry to complicate it. I'm going to say this, and I guess next time I'm going to return to it, but I want to show you a parallel source. Not the Mishnah, but rather, this is pretty advanced rabbinics we're doing right now. It's called the Tosefta. If you haven't heard of the Tosefta, that's totally fine, but welcome to the fun and challenge of rabbinic texts. The Tosefta is parallel to the Mishnah. Meaning, what do I mean by it's parallel to the Mishnah? It's sort of dealing with the same topics, and it's written the same time, but it's not saying the same thing as the Mishnah. And that's where it gets intricate and interesting. We know in general, just as generalization before we see the Tosefta, we know in general, one of the interesting things about rabbinic texts is that they have multiple viewpoints, right? The classic thing is the rabbis present debates about things. So in a way, you could think of the Mishnah as one corpus and a parallel corpus of the Tosefta. They're the same time, they're the same topics. They're actually organized to really, you could read them side by side, but often what's in the Mishnah and the Tosefta is not identical. Sometimes they're even in conflict, but that shouldn't shock us because often the rabbis record debates. Okay, so let's look together. Let's just read it. And I would need your help. Is it the same as the Mishnah or is it different? We have 2 minutes here. So let's look, let's read it and we'll have to analyze it next time. Here's the Tosefta. Let me move that Zoom thing here. The Tosefta says the following. On the bottom, and this is just my underlined line in the Hebrew, but I'll read it in English. If the high priest violates a positive or negative commandment or any commandment, the high priest is treated like an ordinary person in all respects. High priest, if they violate something, they need to answer for their violation. They're just like a regular person. And the next passage, and the last passage we'll see, what about the king? Now we have to learn, does the Tosefta tell us anything about the king? So it does. Oh, sorry, over here. Well, why is it skipping on me? Here, the last line. If the king violates a positive or negative or any other commandment, the king is treated like an ordinary person. So in the Tosefta, the high priest and king are the same. In the Mishnah, they're opposite. Or in a word, if we have to use the Mishnah's terminology, the high priest, what does it mean you're like a regular person? Meaning you're judged. According to the Tosefta, the king is judged. He's not immune. But that leaves us with the fascinating Mishnah that a king is immune. Now, his idea of immunity is unique to the Mishnah. So let me just summarize the last point. What we did tonight, I'm going to do the full review in 45 seconds and get there 60 seconds, including this last thing, just to make sure it was clear. What we did is sort of after that beginning part where we talked about the Hasmoneans and Harrington, interesting stuff, but then we got to our main topic, and that is in the ideal political system, if we could try to tease it out from the Mishnah, what is the standing of the high priest and king? And the argument I was trying to present tonight, it's a little subtle, but I think it's an interesting one, is that they are both important, they're distinct figures, and they're basically on par. They're basically both sort of, there's a distribution, they're on par. We saw this in a ritual context, in terms of public Torah readings, that they each have their moment, they each have their day. The high priest, Yom Kippur, gets to shine, and the king gets to shine once every 7 years, Sukkot. That they both lead a public Torah reading and blessing ceremony and the Torah procession. And then we return to our sources where it's talking more sort of constitutionally, what is their relationship to the judiciary, to immunity, to the law? In the Mishnah, they seem to be on par, but they're opposite. In the Tosefta, they seem to be on par and identical. And then that leaves us, it really whets our appetite to appreciate how the Mishnah is interesting. The Mishnah is sort of the Tosefta, because at the end of the day, I would say, are they like regular people? I would think in Jewish law, everybody has to answer to God. Everybody has to keep the prescripts. Everybody is like a commoner before God in the sense that you can't violate anything. And if you violate anything, rule of law, and you have to answer. That's what the Tosefta says. But the Mishnah, interestingly, introduces a notion of immunity, at least within the court system for the king. And that's really a fascinating thing. In other words, despite this value of rule of law and everybody under God's law, you cannot bring the king into the court. And now we have to sort of analyze that and think we're going to go there next time. We might do one other thing and then we will go there. Have to figure out the next time or in 2 times, but we will go there. Okay, that's it. If anybody has comments or questions, good to see everybody. Let me just look on the chat here also. Okay, I feel bad with the Zoom people to figure out a way to incorporate them a little more.
Thank you very
yeah,
much.
thank you guys. There's some.
Was it who redacted the Mishnah? Was it Judah HaNasi?
Yes.
He was a political figure.
Yeah.
So that's why.
So he gives himself immunity. I like it. Maybe.
I mean,
It's an interesting idea.
that's why.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's why the Tosefta
Yeah.
says forget about it.
Yeah. No, I hear you. Oh. That I'm not sure. I thought you were trying to explain why the Mishnah has immunity.
No, but I just said it was the king, if you will, the Nasi.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah,
And he was not a high priest.
Right.
So on the other hand,
Right.
the Tosefta, which if you say everybody could do a Tosefta, I don't know.
No, I didn't say that
Literally,
exactly. Yeah, I didn't say
those
that.
who knew enough
Yeah.
to write something. or
Yeah, yeah.
have something written.
Yeah. No, I didn't say anybody could write it. I didn't say
No,
that.
but to have someone do it, just if they're illiterate, they just may not be able to write.
Right.
They may have flaws.
Right.
They don't have the knowledge and the skill to write.
Oh, I
But
hear you.
it makes sense why
No, it
the
doesn't seem
Tosefta
to
would say,
compromise.
well, forget about it, the king too, he's not immune.
Right.
So it's just the case of the who.
I hear it. Interesting.
Where
Interesting.
is he?
Leave that.
Ask him, where is he?
You could, Mr. Tenenbaum, you want?
Mr. Tenenbaum, where are you? Huh?
Oh, you're muted though.
Where are you? Huh? I cannot hear you.
Maybe he's muted. He's muted.
Are you in the summer house? Are you in Florida? No? We are curious. You look like this house there. Is that Hampton? Is that the Hampton?
No. I'm in my daughter's room.
Oh,
Hi, Mr. Tanner.
hi.
Hi, Rabbi Flatto.
Hi. Good to see you.
He's a lawyer.
Okay.
You too.
Lawyer to listen
Okay,
to
I'm
you.
gonna